Hello, this is Dr. Morris. This is a slideshow about the origins of rhetoric in Greece, or more precisely, two stories that we can tell about the origins of rhetoric in Greece. I think it's fair to say that no one story of origin is ever the right one. But I think that stories can do some work for us, and that flexibility with those stories and embracing a variety of stories can help us understand, well, our family lives, our country's life, and the lives of our disciplines as well. I want to just caution you that this is not going to be a really specific, detailed, in-depth sort of look. I just want to give some broad strokes of some approaches to the stories of the history of rhetoric, just so that you can see how these stories might impact what we emphasize and what we spend our time thinking and speaking about. So you'll see on the left the image of the octopus, and on the right the image of the raven. We're going to start with we're going to start with rhetoric as the raven. And it comes to us from, the story comes to us from the 5th century BCE, in a story told about two sophists named Corax and Tisias. The famous but apocryphal story of how Tisias tried to cheat his teacher is passed down in the introductions to various rhetorical treatises. According to this tale, Tisias convinced Corax to waive his customary teacher's fee until Tisias won his first lawsuit. However, Tisias conspicuously avoided going to court. Corax then sued Tisias for the fee, arguing that if Corax won the case, he would get his pay, but if Tisias won his first lawsuit, he would then have to fulfill the terms of their original agreement. Some versions of the tale end here. Others attribute a counter-argument to Tisias, that if he lost the case, he would escape paying under the terms of the original agreement, having not yet won a lawsuit, and if he won, there would still be no penalty, since he would be awarded the money at issue. At this point, the judge throws both of them out of court, remarking, "A bad egg from a bad crow." Corax is, of course, the scientific name for the raven. And this story I've always found just absolutely delightful. And I think we can see so many different things going on in this story. One of the things that I think that we can notice is that the two sophists' arguments cancel each other out. And if that is the case, it brings into question the stability of this reasoning process that we have, of this concept of logic. This is a classic paradox, and something the sophists were very closely related to. In fact, rhetoric in this story is connected to sophists. Sophists were itinerant teachers. They were foreigners. In most cases, there were a few citizens of Athens who were considered themselves sophists, but most of them were from outside of the city and were thus considered, as this slide shows, devious, loud, scavenging, and praying. Their deviousness came in that they could argue any point of view. Gorgias, the sophist, is famous for saying, "Propose me a theme, anything. I can do an argument on anything." They are famous for being loud and for picking up any argument that they can, and for making what is called the weaker case the stronger, that is, preying on those who are not making strong arguments. So rhetoric is raven. In this story, rhetoric is closely linked to judicial rhetoric, that is, to the law courts. This is important for a whole bunch of reasons, which I won't go into a lot of detail about, but it's relevant to know that it was linked to judicial on two counts. One, Aristotle and Plato and the other big guys greatly stigmatized the law courts. Um, the juries were huge, hundreds of people, and the arguments tended to be huge spectacles. So I don't know if you've seen the musical Chicago, but I've always thought Razzle Dazzle 'em could have been the theme for these particular speeches. But the judicial nature is also relevant because they were linked to the emerging democracy in Athens, and they were consequently anti-oligarchy or whatever other forms of government where you had the rule of the wisest or the rule of the rich or whoever you wanted to make an argument for. And it was linked to democracy because land was coming available, and folks needed lawyers to make arguments for why they got the land. And it was through owning land that power accrued to citizens, and that in fact citizens became able to participate. So the democracy in Athens was actually in part facilitated by these foreigners who came in and helped make speeches in front of juries and wrote speeches. Most of the people wanting to argue for land were not educated, and so they relied on the sophists. In addition, rhetoric is Raven because it's in the version of this is that it's tainted, and I put that in quotation marks because it's offensive, but it's tainted by immigrants. So one of the things you often hear about Gorgias the sophist is that he was loud and obnoxious and had a very showy use of language. And I've always thought that it's just another way of saying he didn't speak the Athenian dialect, and that this was yet another way of stigmatizing. So Athenians were very, very xenophobic, and the fact that rhetoric is associated with Corax and Tisius and then with Gorgias, this makes it a very suspicious sort of thing. Now, about, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, 15 years ago, I came across Jeffrey Walker's book, Rhetoric and Poetics in Antiquity, and it pretty much rocked my world. I thought I mean, I've always specialized in rhetoric, and I thought I knew a lot about it. And I read this book, and it just completely changed how I saw the world. And there's, again, it's a very sophisticated book, very difficult at parts to read. But what I want to take from it is the concept of the octopus. And at one point, he repeats this story from the Theogonidia. Hope that's right. Demonax. Much is heavy for you to bear. Demonax was someone who was supposed to become, was the son of a leader, and he was supposed to become a leader, and he was not faring well. Demonax, much is heavy for you to bear, for you don't know how to do what's not according to your will. Will, turn toward all friends a many-colored ethos, joining with whatever temper each one has. Have the temper of the convoluted octopus, which takes on the look of the rock it is in converse with. Now be in accord with this, and then be of a different hue. Skillfulness is better than inflexibility. So in this story, rhetoric is octopus. We have a different kind of take on rhetoric. Rhetoric is mysterious in the ways that the octopus would be. It is at times impossible to see the octopus because it blends in so much. And its power is in this not being seen, not calling attention to itself. So really very different from the raven. Its power comes from eloquence. It is linked to a beautiful use of language. a mesmerizing use of language, even a kind of transportation, being transported by language is one of the concepts that we think of with this view of rhetoric. Its main goal is restorative. That is, instead of making something happen, it's bringing peace and bringing wholeness to a community. Now, the rhetoric as octopus view stems back to the 8th century BCE, and it's linked very closely to poetic. We know that the first use of language, particularly in a written form, was poetic, was story-based, was narrative-based. And we don't see poetic having much of a role in Aristotle's rhetoric, but Walker argues that this was the original form of rhetoric, that it was this poetic view. He claims that it serves this restorative function. The basileus is the kind of elder, the wise elder, who oversees the tribe or the group. And when there is disagreement, he uses narrative, excuse me, and story to restore the peace and to bring people back together. So the normative is the role. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of discussion about the importance of these differences, because I think in some ways they're pretty self-evident. But one of the things I do want to point out is that in the Rhetoric is Raven, we have a real split between the language of argument, which is about civic life, which is about public life, and the language of poetic. Keeping in mind that Plato stigmatizes poetic, he throws the poets out of the Republic, and they're highly stigmatized. So the split is early on for this group. In the Rhetoric is Octopus, I think Walker takes a very different take, which is to say we don't need need to have argument in order to have a rhetorical use of language, and narrative and poetry can do the work of rhetoric as well, and that there's simply no need to separate these, that poetry has a role in civic life as well. In fact, it originates as a sort of healing, sort of tonic. So that is just a really brief, as you can see, very surface level view of the origins of rhetoric and the stories that are told about them. I'd be glad to talk more about this with you, and I wish you well, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye-bye.